Good morning, Ian.
Good morning, Alex. It's good that we're together again. Very good.
Yes, lovely. I was missing after a relatively brief summer break. So
Yes, yes.
let's discuss chapter 16 today, Logical
Right.
Paradox, a further study in hemisphere capture. That's the title of your chapter.
Yes, in left hemisphere capture, that's it. And of course we had an earlier chapter, chapter 12, which was about left hemisphere capture in biology. But really here it's quite different thing. It's to do with the nature of paradox and how I attribute many of the paradoxes that have traditionally puzzled philosophers to a conflict between the way in which the left and the right hemisphere tend to see the world.
Mm. Yes, so there is already a first distinction that you make that's valuable to me, because you say we can conceive paradox as error. That's more what the analytical mind would tend to do. But then we can also see it as a deeper level of truth. And that's what you call the imaginative mind would tend to do. So, and then you go one step beyond and you say, and even more, that the negation of this deep truth is also a deep truth. So these negations are beyond errors, are pointing to deeper truths.
Yes, I was making a distinction between two kinds of meaning of paradox, and one is the kind that I explore more in part 3 of the book, which is that the deep nature of reality is paradoxical, according to most spiritual traditions and according to modern physics. But Niels Bohr said, one of the signs of a great truth or a deep truth is that its opposite is also a deep truth. But this does not apply to everyday matters. So, as it were, I either did have milk in my coffee this morning or I didn't, but a wave may be a particle, and those are quite different. So the first one we need to be clear about. It's not that everything is up for grabs, but when we come to the really deep stuff, it is. But I wanted to distinguish that meaning of paradox, which I will explore in chapter 20, at the beginning of part 3, from the kind I'm looking at in this chapter, which, as you know, is logical paradox, i.e. the kind of apparently contradictory results that philosophers find from looking at something in two different ways.
So are these inconsistent propositions that they both seem to be true? I was trying to visualize an image or a metaphor as to, so is it like thinking, looking itself in a mirror, and then in a kind of a black mirror, you see? It's like, here's all the power of thinking, and sometimes it sees itself weirdly distorted, kind of in a mirror. And then the question is, what's going on? What should I do with it?
Yes, that's right, because in most cases of paradox, not in every case, but a very common thing is that it's quite clear that one of the conclusions is wrong, but one feels oneself unable to dismiss it. And I suppose the easiest way to signpost that is to talk about a very famous paradox, Zeno's paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. And this is based on, as I'm sure a lot of people will know, the idea that Achilles was famously swift of foot and a tortoise challenged him to a race. And Achilles said, well, I don't think you're going to win that one. And the tortoise said, no, I not only will win this, but you can never catch me. And so Achilles said, right, well, we'll see, and gave him a head start. And Achilles, according to the logic of the paradox, can in fact never, not only can never overtake the tortoise, but can't ever reach the tortoise. Because the first thing Achilles has to do is to get to where the tortoise is starting from, with its generous head start that Achilles has given it. But by the time he's got there, the tortoise isn't. The tortoise has moved on somewhere else. So his next task is to get to where the tortoise now is. But by the time he gets there, the tortoise has moved on, and so on. So it's an infinite series, and the idea is that an infinite series cannot be resolved in a finite time. But we all know in real life that Achilles is going to overtake the tortoise in a couple of strides. So it's we can see there's something wrong here, but not everyone's been able to put their finger on what is going wrong here.
Yes, and if I can bring forth another image, it is as if when thinking, especially analytical thinking, goes far to the fringes, and fringes here in the good sense, to the limits, then you start seeing this phenomena. It's like weird horizon phenomena where you think something cannot be, but you know or you feel it should be, or it is. And so already going back to this distinction you make between a pure error we need to solve or the realization that there's something really valuable hidden here. And we're discovering in this strange way. I think it's fascinating to conceive paradoxes like that as gifts. You see, there are these gifts that you reach when you go far away, and these gifts can feel uncomfortable, but they are nevertheless there. Now, still, what do we do with them?
Yes, I'd still, though, maintain a distinction between the really deep, rich paradoxes that that a wave and a particle can exist at the same time in the same phenomenon, which certainly is a great gift and changes the way in which we think. Most of physics leads us to question the things we think are certain. But these paradoxes that I deal with in this chapter are mainly gifts to us in the sense that they reveal the limits of a certain kind of way of thinking, which is identifiable as, and I'm sure we'll come on to that, identifiable as the left hemisphere's typical take on things. Yes. And we can see that once again, the left hemisphere is not a guide to truth, is not reliable, is not veridical.
Yes.
And maybe we would think about sort of why that is.
Yes, so there's this capture, as you have in the title, left hemisphere capture. Now you describe that, and then interestingly again, you're gonna present the, let's say, the right hemisphere viewpoint, but not in order to offer solutions to those paradoxes, but to, in a way, see the process by which they happened in the first place.
Exactly. Yes. That's it. I'm not attempting to give a resolution of the paradoxes, but to explain why they occur. Yeah. And there are a number of factors that are involved, and they seem to me to be very typical of the difference between the left and right hemispheres. One that would spring to mind in relation to what the paradox I've just described is the serialization of something that can only be appreciated as a whole. So the breaking down of something into an infinite number of parts. And then finding that this seems to suggest an infinite process in order to regain the whole. But there are two things wrong with this, in my view. One is that you can't. There is a difference in direction. You can break something down analytically infinitely far, so you can carry on breaking down, and there is no limit to how far you can break down. But to reconstruct the whole, you can't get there by just adding the parts again. That again would be an infinite process. But in fact, the whole exists, whether it's once you've broken it down into parts, you've lost the facility to regain that wholeness. There has to be a leap. And the other thing that's wrong with it is that although an infinite series can certainly be derived by dividing up any number, its resolution will be a definite number. It won't be infinity. So, for example, the series 1 plus a half plus a quarter plus an eighth plus a 16th plus a 32nd plus a 64th, so on, it doesn't sum to infinity. It closes in on the number 2. And so, the left hemisphere's idea that you can break things into parts and then resolve them again by making them into a whole lies behind many mistakes, and it's present in the case of Zeno's paradoxes, and in particular in that one of Achilles and the tortoise.
Yes, and probably we should navigate some of the many paradoxes, logical paradoxes you present here. But since you bring forth this problem with serially breaking things and the ability to sew them back together. So, and there's this irreducibility. This already calls to the idea of that's not reducible, which is, again, a limit that the left hemisphere is going to be resistant to accept. And still, it would maintain this attitude or this emotion of feeling surprised. It's like, I've done that and I'm surprised because I cannot put it back, but it will try by all means to put it back, never really stopping and saying, well, maybe I cannot put it back. And there's something in the way this proceeded that just precludes me from doing it. And that'd be the constant blind spot, I suppose, we will be realizing through all these examples of paradoxes.
Yes. I think probably it would be useful, before we go on and look at individual paradoxes, to talk just very briefly, to mention some of the various things to be looking out for. One, obviously, is the notion of fragmentation versus seeing the whole, and the serialization of something that has to be seen as a whole does not achieve the same end. But there are a number of others. One is the left hemisphere's tendency for black and white thinking. Either it's this or it's that. And it may be not that, it may be a matter of degree, and the left hemisphere is not comfortable with the flexibility and the uncertainty that the right hemisphere is able to do. And one paradox that comes to mind for me there is the Sorites paradox, which is, Sorites is the Greek word for a heap. And the idea, as you know, is that one grain of sand is not a heap. And another grain of sand too is not a heap. But if you add an infinite number, or even a finite number, enough, you will have a heap after a while. And the left hemisphere presents a certain paradox. At the beginning of the process, there is no heap. At the end, there is a heap. So there must be a moment at which it becomes a heap. So there must be a particular grain of sand. Before adding it, it's not a heap. After adding it, it is a heap. But that's, again, a problem of fragmentation and serialization, coupled with the difficulty of understanding, if you like, fuzzy boundaries. That what is it? There's another one called the bald man. If a man is completely bald and you're able to transplant a hair, is he still bald? Surely he's still bald. If you add 2 or 3 hairs, he's still bald. But after you've added as many hairs as there are on your very fine own head, Alex, then you're obviously not bald. So there must have been a point at which you ceased to be bald and became a hairy man. And but of course there isn't. And it is the left hemisphere's insistence on rigid boundaries, black and white, whereas we're all used to the idea that somebody's, balding, but then you can say, in English, you say as bald as a coot, which means completely bald, not a hair. And then the similar thing you can say about a heap, well, there's a small heap or a bit of a heap, and then there's a small heap, and then there's a great heap. So we're used to this idea of a non-segmented spectrum along which something can move, whereas the left hemisphere must slice it. And that's going to be very important when we come to things in part 3, like flow and time, because the problem in understanding them is the left hemisphere's tendency to time slice and to slice motion.
Yes. And that also already here, because you quote Bergson quite a few times, I think it's an invaluable ingredient in understanding all of that. Now, with respect to what you just mentioned and these lights that you bring to offer, not solutions but lights, I really appreciated that one you make about not the truths should not be all the time equal, non-equal truths. There's a degree also in the truthness of statements, and pretending there's none is often what creates this kind of sleight of hand or sleight of mind in presenting a paradox, because those two things are presented as if they were equally true, where there's also a degree in truth, and that's what affects the paradox.
Yes, I mean, the left hemisphere is obsessed with equality and symmetry. If it's got two things that are true, they must be equally true, but they never are. And one of the long lasting messages in all my work is that we need the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, but they're not a symmetrical pair. I mean, they're actually physically not symmetrical, but one of them is more important than the other. And another thing, I suppose, is that context changes something, so that the context of one kind of truth means that it might be very true in one situation, but not in another. As Ian Whitehead said, in assessing whether a proposition is true or not, it's usually not a question of whether it could be true. Most things could be true under certain circumstances. The question is, under which circumstances is it true, and under which circumstances is it not true? And he applied that to science as well. So scientific truths are rarely all or nothing. They are true in certain terms, but not in other contexts.
Yes. Another element that we can bring in now, I think, is that to me, this is one of the most fascinating ones to try to conceive, is that this kind of retrospective fallacy. It has to do with chopping and with degrees of truth, but it's this idea that because I can post hoc think about it, or that's equivalent to the process that gave birth to it, like as the generative process being equal to the kind of the reconstructive process after the fact. And that's not the case, and that has a lot to do with being embodied and living, and actually, you know, being a process in time, and not just something that it doesn't matter if you tell it while it's happening, before or even after.
Yes, that's lovely, and it is another theme that has been one that those who followed us so far will be familiar with, which is the difference between the presence of something in the right hemisphere and the representation in the left, which automatically brings in the idea of this after the fact. It's representation. It's something happening again after it's really happened. And so what the left hemisphere produces is not really what one has been looking at as experiencing it as embodied in being in time. But as you say, it's something that's taken out of the context of time, simplified as a spatial metaphor of a line. And then one can, in that line, one can retrospectively point and say there is a point there. And one is right. In that line, there is a point. But you cannot make the line out of an infinite number of points, because a point has no thickness at all. And even an infinite number of them has no thickness whatever. So a line can never be achieved by adding points. Although once a line is there, a point can be found in it. And in that sense, it's like time. Time doesn't happen by the addition of another slice. But in retrospect, you can go back and say at that very instant, something happened. And so there's a great difference there. And it's probably worth referring here to a favorite paradox of mine, the unexpected examination, which is a very interesting one. It reveals a number of the points we're talking about. And the unexpected examination, or I think quite commonly it's known to philosophers as the unexpected hanging. Either a person is told that he will be hanged this week, but that he will not know which day, or somebody in the class is told that the teacher will set a test, an examination this week, but it will be unexpected. So now the problem here is that, viewed by the left hemisphere, this examination or this hanging can never now happen, because it clearly can't happen on Friday, because then it would be expected, because that's the last day on which it could happen. And so it can't happen on a Friday. But because it can't happen on a Friday, Thursday becomes the last day on which it could possibly happen. And because it's the last day on which it could possibly happen, by the time it's not an unexpected date, and so on. And so the same applies to all the days in the week. And you find that this unexpected examination can never actually happen. There are a number of aspects with this. The first thing you notice is that you have to start from the completed series and work backwards. So not as the person that actually lives this week, not knowing what is happening at any day, expecting, but instead starting from the completed representation and working back by eliminating pieces to find that something that we know is possible cannot be possible. Another thing is, of course, that as well as retrospecting, we are time slicing by days. Another is that both context and degree are being neglected. So, for example, each day has a sort of context, because time is a context, and you can't get time out of this week. And so at the beginning of the week, there are 5 days on which this thing can happen. And at that point, it is a completely unpredictable event. As the week bears on, it becomes slightly more predictable. But it would be a fool who started and says, well, of course, it can never happen working backwards, because on Wednesday there suddenly is an examination, which the left hemisphere has proved can't ever take place. But suddenly there is, and you're not prepared for it. So, in fact, in living forwards in time, by living through time fluently, we have different shades of degree, we have different contexts, we don't have serialization, and we don't have that retrospection. We have a moving in the opposite direction. So the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere see this in at least 4 different ways.
I love it. Each of those are, to me, like working koans to reflect. Of course, a first impression could be, what a waste of time, I need to cook or clean the house, and why should I waste time on this? But then second stage is, okay, let's entertain these paradoxes. Now, if you stay there from a more analytical point of view, I don't know where you went, but then the third stage is precisely what you're doing, try to extract from it these elements, and then it becomes as a great revelation. And it points in a way the stupidity of intelligence, like how stupid, like some kind of thinking that appears to be very clever can just reveal itself to be some sort of an absurdity in logical thinking. Now, this can get into rather pathological states, I may say, and you here mentioned Parmenides, who end up denying the existence of change, right? And of course, he's a giant. I'm not diminishing him, but how interesting that, or as you point out, Bergson said, well, you could have asked Achilles how he did it. Just ask him. I mean, it's clear he overtook the turtle. Come on, just ask the guy and he'll tell you. And instead of that, instead of accepting it's a problem as a gift, again, to our own way of conceptualizing all that, it's like we project it onto the world. There must be something with the world in a way. Maybe we deny change, or maybe we say, really, the thing could not happen. So that's do you see that as some sort of pathological state? Maybe it's too much to say, but it's like this point where it's very, as we've covered throughout many chapters, it's very left hemisphere. It's like, I'm going to deny anything that doesn't fit my own story rather than revising the story.
Yes, I mean, without necessarily saying it's pathological, though I know what you're getting at there. I mean, one could certainly say that it is non-veridical. Its take is non-veridical. It is somehow misunderstanding the nature of reality and therefore coming to an absurd conclusion. But of course, the left hemisphere is much more prone to pathology. I mean, that's something that we've discussed before quite early on, is that, all the syndromes in which the world is completely mistaken, its nature is misunderstood, are very nearly all of them. I can think of one exception, but we've dealt with all that. But in general, the great misunderstandings and the persistent misunderstandings, the gross misunderstandings, are almost inevitably due to the right hemisphere being damaged and the left hemisphere being left trying to construct reality out of its fragmentary grasp of, seeing things as put together by addition. And of course, one of the points about it bringing infinity is that infinity is not the end of a series. There needs to be a leap to infinity. It's not like number. So you can carry on numbers infinitely long, but you will never actually reach infinity. And one of the things that people find difficult to understand is that a line a millionth of an inch long is as far from infinity as one that is thousands of millions of light years long. It's got no nearer infinity by being prolonged. So infinity is not achieved by addition in the way that the left hemisphere tries to achieve something, but it needs a leap. And I think that's good, because there are a number of things in which in order to understand them, there needs to be a leap. I've mentioned extension, which I don't think is enough talked about, that extension in space and extension in time, what Bergson calls durée in time, is what we experience. And because it's so close to us, we don't take in its absolutely fluent, extensive nature. Instead, our thinking mind immediately sets about saying that moment, that day, the next day, in the future, etc. It breaks it up automatically. So extension is something that brings something new into the cosmos, not just particles, not just instants, but extension in time, extension in space. And that requires a leap, just as infinity requires a leap from a numerical series. And it's also true about, well, it's true about consciousness. We'll come to talk about that. You can't get to consciousness by adding little increments of something. There is a moment at which a leap has to be taken. But also motion. And here one comes across good old Parmenides, as you say, who believed that motion was impossible and that everything must really be stasis, that motion was an illusion. Partly because you can't get from stasis, which we see sometimes around us or think we see, although it's only very reduced motion, actually. We see that and we think, how do we get from there to motion? So I think Aristotle had a paradox, or when a body is set in motion, at the moment the motion begins, is it static or is it in motion? And that's the problem the left hemisphere comes to by imagining that there is such a thing as complete stasis, first of all, and then imagining somehow that there's a problem about getting from there to motion.
Yeah, the leap idea is, I think, is perhaps the most important of this chapter, in my view. And it's towards the end because it invites the following one, which is going to be about intuition. And another image comes to mind, maybe because I've spent the last week in Paris and surrounded by nature and so on. But I often feel we like to walk on stones, but let's say we're crossing a river and the stones have some, it's not a continuous bridge. So we may need to step on something, let's say, safe and rational, but then we need to, in a way, leap to the next stone. And there is a refusal to do that. It's like a sense of vulnerability that the use of logic seems to manifest, like, no, I'm not gonna step from this to there because there's this leap, and if I engage in that, something horrible can happen. Maybe I'm psychologizing too much, but there's something like that, like a refusal to, and it's not like a leap that just goes floating in empty space forever. It's like literally like walking. I remember a song my 3-year-old sings, which is about this bird that's limping and has one leg on the air and the other one on the ground, and it's walking like this. And I think it's a perfect metaphor because you step on something concrete, but then even the very act of walking has this moment of vulnerability where you need to leap to the next one, but you're still back safe, and that's how you move forward.
Yes, that's very good. And you're not over psychologizing, because I think this illuminates a certain aspect of the left hemisphere, which it is constantly anxious if things are not certain. It can't tolerate uncertainty, vulnerability. And yet, of course, there is nothing random about the steps that one takes. It would be foolish to believe that because there was no certainty that you couldn't take that step. We'll come back to that again, I think, in the future, in looking at in part 3 at what we can know about the cosmos. But the idea that we have to have a certain leading from this to the next, rather than see that there is a chain here that we can take a leap to, not at all in a random way, in a very rational way, but nonetheless it has to be a leap of intuition because it can't be argued towards.
Yes, beautiful. Yes. Okay, so there are more elements, right? You mentioned self-paradox and also nominalism and language. Maybe we can talk about these a little bit. These are interesting too.
What are you thinking of here? Are you thinking of the paradox of Pierre, or?
Well, I'm not pointing to any in particular, but you point to the use of language as a trick itself, because it thingifies reality, and also the belief that because you name it, somewhat becomes real, and there you're trapped again, right? Because you've named it in this way.
Yes,
You've set yourself a kind of a dead end through language.
yes, that's right. Um, I was thinking there of Kripke's paradox of Pierre. Pierre knows that there is a place called London, and in his mind, it is a very beautiful and fascinating place. And then, or in his mind, it's Londres anyway. And then he goes to Londres, which he's told is London, and he finds that it's not the place he imagined at all. So is it the same place? Is it that the London he visited and the Londres in his mind are not the same place, or are they the same place? So the language thing is the element of the paradox there. And I think this is also in things like people saying that to say that something doesn't exist is to at least affirm its existence and then deny it. So unicorns don't exist, apparently, according to a certain kind of linguistic philosopher, starts by asserting there are unicorns and then denies them. But these are problems that we get into from thinking that language, instead of being a very fallible set of symbols that we've set up in order to work in daily life for most purposes, are somehow eternal truths, and that having mentioned a unicorn, we've brought it into existence, which is a wonderfully silly idea, but only a philosopher. It's an idea so silly that only a philosopher could possibly come up with it.
Yes, you put it also beautifully. You write something like evaluating. It's like asking somebody to evaluate a situation which cannot exist, and then blaming him or her for not being able to solve it. Now, this poses a question to me, which I wanted to share with you. So how is that different than, let's say, Gedanken experiments, or even the use of imagination? Because I see, again, there's a gradient. Like, you can make up all sort of absurd situations and then just have tons of philosophy PhDs just reflecting on that. But there's also a power in imagining things that I'm not sure if I would say they don't exist. Maybe they have a different mode of existence, and from there you can arrive at great truth. So where do things go awry? When do things get stuck in this exercise of conceiving, imagining stuff that we know it's not, at least here in the physical world as we know?
Yes, it's an interesting point. I suppose what I would feel, I don't know if you would agree with me about this, about thought experiments, is that they're useful. I mean, they may be fun when one makes an imaginative scenario that can't possibly exist. But for them to be informative, there needs to be at least a possibility that this thing could actually happen, it seems to me. So we can discover things by, as it were, going there in our minds, but it's only going to be useful if these are places that in reality one could go, if they are about things that can never happen. I mean, this becomes important right at the end of this chapter, when which I saved. I deal with, as you know, probably about, I think it's about 30 paradoxes of different kinds that philosophers have commonly pointed to. But at the end, I leave to the end the paradoxes of time travel or foretelling the future, because these do lead to impossible situations. And I think what they signify is the very important fact that time travel and telling the future cannot happen. At least that's my take on it. I think once one starts saying that at least time travel can take place, it may be possible, I suppose, for one to have an inkling of something that comes. I wouldn't like to exclude that, and there's certainly some mystics and others who say they have experienced, foreshadowings of things that turned out precisely the way that they perceived them in a dream or something like that. So you can go back into the past and potentially murder your grandfather, which means that you can't exist. Now, if you could do that, move in time, we would be reduced to silence, because nothing one says would make any sense. Time, I mean, this is a point I think is very important. and we'll no doubt come to that in chapter 22. But my belief is, and I'm supported in this by particularly the thinking of Lee Smolin, who's written about time at great length, is that time is the one thing that one cannot think away, because if you do, it makes nonsense of the whole business of life. So yes, I think thought experiments are helpful as long as they stick to things that actually could happen. What would happen if we had, a very large number of whatever it is rather than just a small number? Would that change the nature of the experience or whatever? Yeah.
Let me move on to some other concerns that I have. Let's see how I can pose them. So we've talked about emotion, and we haven't talked so much about ethics. So again, at the risk of psychologizing the hemispheres, I wonder if we can discuss a bit about how would the left versus the right feel about such paradoxes, and also the ethics understood as how they would feel like doing about them. I think it's very important to try to convey, because that's not just a theoretical exercise. I'm imagining, as I'm reading the paradoxes, the many paradoxes you have in this chapter, or some of our viewers are reading them, they may induce different emotions in the reader, right? Maybe a feeling of awe, or maybe some discomfort, or maybe a challenge. And I think those emotions in the very reader can be very telling as what's going on, right? So maybe we can talk a bit about that.
Well, can you expand on that? I must say I haven't thought a lot about that.
Okay, so I can put on my let's say my analytical philosopher's hat and just dwell on them, maybe as a way to reveal something about logic, maybe to improve the logic. So then I'm just engaging in this, but in a way perhaps my emotion is that I need to crack this problem, right?
Yes.
But then I can also, for instance, engage in these time paradoxes. Like, let me bring again Bergson and Einstein, right? As an opportunity to maybe show that there's something vital that's missing, and one can have this sense that I want to know what that is. I'm like very excited, like a kid. There's a gift there. I want to find what that is. So that would just activate in me an emotion of wonder. I can then spend a lot of time with it and start to become tired. And it's like, okay, it's like, I just want to get rid of this.
Yes.
And then I get nervous, like, what do I need to negate here? And I need to solve this as soon as possible. I can get nervous, I can get tired. And I just think sometimes realizing the emotion that the very same paradox can arise in me and in me next week is interesting, because it reveals in a way, it reveals what it is doing to me, apart from something interesting to talk about.
Well, yes, I mean, I think everybody likes paradoxes because they're fun. They're like a problem that demands to be solved, and we all like attempting to solve enigmas, solve problems. So I think that's right, and it is kind of fun, and it's teasing because when one starts, as you say, using one's logical mind to approach the paradoxes, one can't quite see what's gone wrong here. And really what I'm trying to do is to help one, in a way, be a bit of a spoilsport and say, I think I can see what's happening here. You don't really need to lie awake all night trying to resolve this, because this is an essentially irresolvable conflict. If you take the extreme left hemisphere way of thinking far enough and push it, you will arrive at something that just isn't right. But the bit of your mind, the left hemisphere that created it, is saying, but it's true. And your experiential mind is saying, well, I know it isn't. And I mean, I don't really know what to say about that, except to say that paradoxes are more interesting the more they have to do with the situations we might find ourselves in, like, the ship of Theseus paradox, for example, because that's something like our lives, our bodies, and the Greeks. Greeks were interested in a question which I think has probably occurred to all of us at some time in our lives independently, which is the bits of our bodies are being replaced all the time. and yet we seem to be the same person continuously. How do we reconcile these facts? Because after perhaps a period of some years, there may be almost no cell in your body that was there 7 years ago, or however many years ago it might be. So that is has the same structure, and is a very real paradox as the ship of Theseus paradox, which is again for the viewer is a paradox related to the fact that Theseus made some voyages, famous exploits, and he was a bit of a hero, and on his return the ship in which he'd made these journeys and carried out these exploits was preserved in the harbour at Athens. But after a while a timber would begin to rot, and so it would be replaced, and eventually all the timbers in the ship needed to be replaced. At that point, was it still the ship of Theseus? And if it wasn't, at what point did it cease to be the ship of Theseus and become not the ship of Theseus? And so that's an important paradox in a way. And I think it's quite a teaser, really, because we like to think that we are continuously the same person. And I think in order to understand that, one has to see the distinction between the gestalt and the parts. So the gestalt of me, the form of me, is present and is continuous, though things come and go within it. And that is not different from a cell over a few seconds, because that cell is recognizably the same cell with its same function in the body. But actually, if you knew all the myriad, enormously rapid transformations that were taking place in that cell, with things coming and going from its overall nature, indeed from its membrane alone, which is much more fluid than we tend to conceive it, would we think it was the same cell? Well, I would like to say we do think it's the same cell, and I think it is. And the reason that I'm saying that is because I believe the right hemisphere sees the importance of the gestalt. It sees the importance of the persistence of something and the wholeness of something, whereas the left hemisphere sees not the persistence but the time-sliced entity, and also the fragmented entity. So the thing is the sum of the parts. So that is how that thing comes into being.
Yes, and you use that image of based on dimensions, right? And you speak about transcending the frame of reference. That also helps to visualize. In a way, it's how to solve the problem, but not really. It's okay. You can think of something happening on a plane, and in a plane, as Flatland, beautifully puts it, some things may seem impossible, which is why I was alluding to the emotion of the spectator, because I was thinking of magic tricks. And in the presence of a magician, you can have hecklers, you can have very rational people that are just there trying to understand what happened. You can have a more like childlike attitude where you just let the whole thing fall into you and you're marvelous. So in Flatland, these magic tricks happen. And the solution is, well, if we go from 2D to 3D, we transcend our frame of reference. And in a way, I like it because it's inclusive, it unifies, it includes the 2D. It doesn't say that's rubbish, but it says, well, it's by this new dimension. There, the trick is done mathematically through dimension. By this new dimension, we grow our perspective, and then, well, it's the leap we're talking about. It's some sort of transcendence.
It's a leap, it's a transcendence in that sense, and it's also an observation of different contexts. So perhaps an example of this would be the liar paradox, the famous Cretan paradox. He says all Cretans are liars, but he himself is a Cretan. So is the statement to be taken as true, or is it taken as false? And if it's taken as false, then all Cretans are not liars. But if it's taken as true, then Cretans are liars, which means that the statement is false, which means that the statement is true, which means that the statement is false, and so on. So that's a problem that seems to me like the simpler version of it. This statement is false. False if true and true if false. The problem here is that we have not taken note of two different contexts, really. One is, for example, in the case of the Cretans, one is a context in which there is another human being talking to us, speaking perhaps a little ironically about the whole of the people from which he comes. And the other is a very tight, logical knot, which he is imagining will cause amusement rather than despair, won't cause you to reject logic, but will make you think this is very amusing because what's happening is a slightly different context is being given to the thing. So if you are, I think, frankly, rather autistic, then you will see that this statement is impossible. But it was actually made in the context of a song, of a poem that was understood by its audience to be amusing, in which the speaker is mocking himself and so on. So again, the right hemisphere understands that. And the image I have of a different context is that of a spiral. So these things look circular, as though you go out from here and you come back in at the same point. You exit from it being false and you find you're back in it as true. But the other way to think about it is that having taken that into account, you now move to a higher level in which you can resolve this by saying, yes, but there's a different context, a part of what is being stated here, from the context for the other part of what is being stated here.
Yes, and in that resolution, integration, expansion, I wonder, do you think the analytical mind has solved some of the paradoxes that you have in this chapter? Are they some quasi-successful attempts, or do you still, they all lay there as true paradoxes, like the knot cannot be untied unless you transcend it? Or maybe some of the answers that the left hemisphere might propose are already pseudo-leaps. For instance, let me put an example here, and I don't know if these paradoxes really belong to the logical paradoxes, but we've talked a lot about paradox, but not so much about logic. And now, for instance, in quantum mechanics, one can make more sense of what's going on by swapping, by abandoning the Boolean logic, and now have a logic where, for instance, you could easily say the order matters, like 2 times 3 is 6 and 3 times 2 is 6. But if you ask, for instance, a question, how are you doing today? And then you ask, do you remember when your father died? Now, if you swap the orders of the questions, you would get very different answers. So that gives you a sense of non-commutability, right? So you could argue that that's something very analytical in the way it can be conceived. So I was wondering, can some of these paradoxes be solved by changing the logic? So logical paradoxes perhaps can be changed by adopting a different logic. And would that still be left brain, or is it like left and right brain working together again? Sorry, it's a convolved question, but
yes,
yeah.
I'm not sure I entirely understood the point you were making about the two questions: how are you today, and when did your father die?
Yeah, sorry. So there's a fascinating field called quantum cognition, which is it's quantum not in the literal sense, but it's in the sense of having to, they are agnostic about Mercury or tubal, whatever, but the idea is that you can understand a lot of you can understand and design certain psychological experiments that will be really hard to explain from a normal logic point of view. But if you use a quantum logic, so a mathematical structure that has this, for instance, non-commutability property, and then the phenomena make a lot of sense. And actually, they argue that some of the experiments you can design would not be explainable, or you would need to add on many extra hypotheses with the classical logic, right? So I was wondering if, and those sort of questionnaires are interesting. You can swap the order in which you make question A and B, and you would get very different results, right? So I was wondering if that logic is an example of maybe the left brain at its best, trying to propose a different logic that starts to sound like the leap we were talking about from the right hemisphere.
Well, there is something called paraconsistent logic, as I'm sure you know, which has been proposed, and I think is quite a useful idea to resolve the situations effectively where the law of the excluded middle doesn't apply. That middle is not excluded. And so I think that is a very helpful step. But what you are saying to me puts me in mind of something I advert to, I'm not sure in which chapter, which is Quine's, he changed it in a later edition of the book, but in the introduction to one of the books, I can't remember now which, he says that if something is true, a sentence is true, then all the other sentences that have the same structure must be true. But that is clearly not the case. You can't go simply from the structure of something to its being true, because the same structure of two sentences can lead one to a true or a false conclusion. And we may have looked at that. Did we? I don't know if we ever talked about the experiments of logic in which the left and right hemispheres had different ways of answering the logical outcome of a syllogism. Did we talk about that?
Yes, I remember. Not exactly what, but I think we touched on that. Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, for example, this is a thing about the porcupine. So all porcupines climb trees. The porcupine is a monkey. All porcupines climb trees. And the trouble there is that does seem to follow from the logical structure, but it just is wrong, because porcupines happen not to be monkeys. So there is a problem with equating truth in the world from experience with truth as the outcome of a certain set of algebraic steps.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's what you were adverting to, but the right hemisphere, in what I'm saying is that in those experiments, where subjects were asked one hemisphere at a time suppressed, their right hemisphere would say in a commonsensical way, well, no, it's wrong because the porcupine is not a monkey. But the left hemisphere would insist, the same person would say it is true, because that's what it says on the piece of paper. So the structure is preserved, but the reality is not. Yeah. And that seems to me to be a typical left hemisphere problem, which prioritizes an internal structure over really what is in the end the most important way of understanding what a truth is correspondence with everything we know at the highest level. So not just everyday experience, but the thing that fits with everything else that we know and with our own experience of it. It's a combination of different ways of thinking about truth. And so it's like, I think it's Susan Hark says about James's idea of truth, the pragmatic idea of truth, that if you hold such a truth, you will be less often caught out by reality. And I like that very much as a definition of what it means to be onto a truth, is that you will be caught out less often than you would be otherwise.
Yes. Oh, thank you for saying that, because it also brought to my mind indigenous ways of knowing, which we cannot talk about. But maybe it was in one of these examples where there was some syllogism about animals, and there was a very straightforward way to answer, which was, well, I'm not going to engage in your logical structure, and what you're saying doesn't make any sense. And my response as an indigenous way of knowing doesn't have, it seems fallacious to you, but that's your problem. So, here we have these modes of knowing, and also I was alluding to what quantum mechanics may have done to our minds by pointing out that maybe the rules or some assumptions need to be at least suspended. And maybe this is a good way to wrap it up, because we're talking about logical paradox and also indigenous ways of knowing and quantum mechanics, and even neuroscience we could bring in as an invitation to think beyond these assumptions that we take for granted. And maybe intuition, by doing that leap, that's what it also achieves.
Yes. Well, yes, I think you're alluding there to Alexandre Luria's experiment with people in Siberia in the 1930s, and finding that they answered logical questions that Westerners would answer in one way, in a different way, prioritizing experience. And Christopher Hallpike, another anthropologist, has made some very nice observations on this. And so they were asked things like, where there is ice and snow, bears are white. There is ice and snow at the North Pole. are the bears there white? And instead of going, well, the logic tells me they are, they say, well, the only bears I've ever seen are brown. And I don't like to speak of things I've never seen. And then the question would say, but let's say it is definitely so that there is this snow and ice there. What do you think? And they say, well, if an I think he says if an old experienced traveler had been there and seen it and reported it, then I might believe it to be true. Yeah. So it's wonderful because he's answering in the way in which one would do so as a living person trying to negotiate one's way through the world without falling into thinking traps, rather than the kind of clever way of just answering according to the logic of the question.
Yes, yes, great. And you made me you remind me of a residency I did with an artist long ago. She was a dancer and I was studying animal movement. So we had this beautiful exchange, but it was also weird because I would engage in this clever questioning and she would politely refuse and say, well, can we think about this tomorrow? And you know, she was Portuguese, so the language also brought some poetry to the way she was expressing it, which basically meant, shut up. I mean, what's this question? Another way she would put it is, well, let's try. Can we try what you're saying? So can we just embody and live it rather than speculate about it? Otherwise, what do you want me to say?
Yes,
very nice. Very humbling.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, it's good for us, I think, to be sometimes put in our place. A philosophical friend of mine was talking to his wife about what he was relating what he was working about and thinking on it, and she said, whoever said all that didn't have enough ironing and cooking to do. Anyway. However, returning from those somewhat amusing areas, I think there are very many serious points that come out of inspecting paradoxes, which is to help us focus on what happens when our left hemisphere mind takes over and alters the structure of reality. Then it doesn't seem any longer to be cognate with the reality that we experience. Yes, and yes. I think they're valuable in that way.
Yeah, thanks for closing it like this. It's an invitation to return to the real world. Please come back now or soon. Yes. This is in a way what we'll be exploring in the following chapter, how intuition not only affects the leap, but also grounds us back into our bodies and into our worlds.
Yes, and just before signing off, something that I think is interesting is that, you know, people may, the intuitions of a logician may be against intuition. They may say, well, these leaps, I'm not sure I hold with that. But one of the most logically tyrannized philosophers of all time, Leibniz, himself said that there is no way to jump over, prosilere in Latin, to jump over to infinity from a series of steps and so on. And of course, he was the person who, well, the kudos is divided between him and Newton because they developed calculus at the same time. But the infinitesimal calculus is a way of arriving at an approximate answer to an area that can't be strictly measured because it's under a curve. Mm-hmm. And the way around this is to make an enormous number of very tiny, very long rectangles that fit under and sum them. So it is still an approximation. So at the end, he nicely demonstrated that you can't actually get from this measurable finite thing to something that doesn't have that structure. You have in the end to make a leap. So all around us, in looking at space and looking at time, looking at motion and looking at consciousness, there are moments at which we have to make this leap. And if we don't make the leap, then we suddenly think something's gone wrong with thinking. It's not something that's gone wrong with thinking in the sense that we can't think about this. It's that a certain type of thinking will lead you astray.
Yeah. There are warnings. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Iain, as always.
Oh, thanks, Alex.
It's a pleasure to talk to you about these things. I'm enjoying so much and learning so much through this process. Thank you very much.
It's been a great delight. And next time we're going to presumably talk about the first chapter in the section called Intuition, Imagination and Truth.
Yeah, yes, and it's chapter 17, Intuition's Claims on Truth. I think that's the next chapter. Really
That's
looking
right,
forward.
yes, that's right. Good. All right, well, till next time.
See you then.
See you
Bye-bye.
then. Thanks. Bye-bye.